We live in this world where everyone's trying to teach us how to be more persuasive, how to influence others, how to get what we want. And if you're recovering from burnout, you might think learning these skills will help you advocate for yourself better, set boundaries, maybe even advance your career without burning out again. But here's what I've noticed. The very act of trying to become more persuasive might be one of the things keeping you stuck. Let me explain what I mean. When you're burned out, you've usually spent years convincing yourself to push through. You've mastered the art of internal persuasion. You know how to talk yourself into staying late, taking on extra projects, saying yes when you mean no. You've become so good at persuading yourself to override your own signals that you've lost touch with what you actually need. Now you're in recovery, and suddenly everyone's telling you to learn influence techniques, to craft better arguments, to be more compelling. And without realizing it, you're applying these same tools to yourself again. You're trying to persuade yourself to feel better, faster, to be more productive, to have more energy than you actually have. It's like trying to cure an addiction to caffeine by switching to a stronger coffee. Here's the thing about persuasion that most people don't talk about. Real influence isn't about getting people to do what you want. It's about creating alignment. It's about finding where your needs and their needs actually intersect. And you can't do that if you don't know what you need in the first place. Barack Obama understood this deeply. Watch his best speeches. He wasn't trying to convince people to think differently. He was helping them see what they already knew to be true. He was reflecting back their own values and showing them how those values connected to a bigger picture. That's completely different from manipulation or even traditional persuasion. It's about truth-telling. And when you're recovering from burnout, truth-telling is exactly what you need to practice. Think about it this way. Burnout happens when there's a massive gap between what you're pretending to be okay with and what you actually feel. You've been running this internal campaign, persuading yourself that everything's fine, that you can handle more, that you should be grateful for the opportunities. The path out isn't to become better at persuasion. It's to become better at listening. Tony Robbins talks a lot about the power of asking better questions. But here's the question most people in burnout recovery never ask themselves. What if I stop trying to convince myself of anything for a while? What if instead of crafting the perfect argument for why you deserve better boundaries, you just noticed when you feel overwhelmed? What if instead of persuading yourself to be more grateful, you just acknowledge when something doesn't feel right? This doesn't mean you become passive. It means you become honest. And honesty, it turns out, is the most persuasive force there is. When you stop performing for yourself, something interesting happens. You stop performing for everyone else, too. You start showing up as you actually are, not as the version of yourself you think will be most convincing. And people respond to that authenticity in ways they never responded to your perfectly crafted arguments. I've seen this happen over and over. Someone in burnout recovery decides to just tell the truth about their capacity instead of trying to negotiate their way into having more of it. They say, I can't take this on right now, instead of launching into a detailed explanation of why they should be allowed to say no. The response is almost always better than what they expected. Here's why. When you're trying to persuade someone, you're essentially saying, my perspective is more valuable than yours, and I need to change your mind. When you're just being honest, you're saying, this is what's true for me right now, and I trust you to handle that information well. People feel the difference. They feel respected instead of manipulated. Now, this doesn't mean you never advocate for yourself. It doesn't mean you become a doormat. It means you ground your advocacy in truth instead of strategy. When you need to have a difficult conversation with your boss about workload, you don't spend hours crafting the perfect argument. You spend time getting clear on what's actually happening for you. You notice where you feel stretched. You acknowledge what you're afraid of. You get honest about what you need. Then you share that truth, simply and directly. I've been thinking about my current workload, and I'm noticing I'm not able to give my best work to everything on my plate. I'd like to talk about how we can prioritize these projects so I can deliver quality results. No manipulation, no elaborate persuasion strategy, just truth. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it works even when the other person says no, because you're not trying to control the outcome. You're just putting accurate information into the world and letting people respond to it honestly. And when you do that consistently, something shifts. People start trusting you more. They start seeing you as someone who tells the truth, even when it's inconvenient. That's a kind of influence that no persuasion technique can create. This is especially important if you're someone who's always been the fixer or the people pleaser. You might be afraid that without your persuasion skills, you'll lose your value to others. But the opposite is true. When you stop trying to convince people of things, you create space for them to convince themselves. And that's infinitely more powerful. So here's what I want you to try. For the next week, notice when you're trying to persuade yourself of something. When you catch yourself crafting internal arguments about why you should feel different than you do, just pause. Ask yourself, what if this feeling is actually information instead of something I need to fix? Notice when you're trying to persuade others, too. When you catch yourself building elaborate cases for why someone should see things your way, pause again and ask yourself, what's the simple truth here that I'm afraid to say? This isn't easy work, especially if you spent years perfecting your persuasion skills, but it's the work that actually leads to lasting change. Not because you've convinced anyone of anything, but because you've created space for what's real to emerge. And what's real, it turns out, is usually more compelling than you could ever make up.